On a storm-washed coast in Newport, in the summer of 1895, a carriage stops before a marble mansion built on grief. Inside Rosegate House lives a widowed magnate feared by men, a little girl who has not spoken since her mother's death, and a silence so heavy it feels like a curse. When Tiffany Caldwell arrives as the new governess, she brings more than gentle hands and a steady voice. She carries a ruined past, a hidden courage, and a choice that will test the limits of duty and desire. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what do you love most about historical romances? The arrival at Rosegate House. In the summer of 1895, when Newport glittered with the restless splendor of the Gilded Age, the winds that crossed the Atlantic carried whispers of fortunes won and hearts broken. High above the rugged cliffs, where the sea hurled itself endlessly against the rocks, stood Rosegate House, an estate of pale marble and silent corridors, built by a man whose name commanded both awe and fear. It was toward this solemn mansion that Tiffany Caldwell traveled, seated inside a modest hired carriage that trembled with every turn of the coastal road. The afternoon light flickered through the window, brushing her face with gold. She lifted her chin, finding strength in the quiet elegance she had cultivated from the scattered pieces of a life once promised to be grander. 25 years had placed gentleness in her expression and endurance in her spine. Her hazel eyes, deep with memory, drifted to the small valise at her side. Inside it lay the sum of her possessions, a few dresses, her mother's brooch, and a single folded letter whose edges had grown soft with time. When the carriage halted before the great entrance, Tiffany drew a breath, scented with salt, ivy, and distant roses. Rosegate House rose before her with austere majesty, its facade cold and immaculate, its windows tall and watchful. Columns framed the doorway like guardians of a world she had not been born to enter. A tremor passed through her, not of fear, but of awareness. Once she had walked among New York's drawing rooms with the confidence of a debutante. Now she was here as an employee, seeking a place where she might matter again. The heavy oak door opened with a sound that echoed through the courtyard. Mrs. Enfield, the housekeeper, appeared, her posture straight, her expression composed into a mask of stern efficiency. Her iron-grey hair was tucked under a cap, white as winter frost. "Miss Caldwell," she said, not unkindly, yet with not a drop of warmth. "You are expected." Tiffany descended from the carriage with practiced poise. She felt the scrutiny of the woman before her, felt the estate itself watching, assessing whether she deserved to walk its polished floors. The housekeeper led her inside, her steps measured, her keys clinking softly with each movement. The entrance hall was vast and cool. Marble floors gleamed like still water, reflecting the light of crystal chandeliers that hung from a ceiling, painted with distant faded cherubs. The air smelled of lemon oil and old stone. Along the walls, portraits of Blackstone's long departed gazed down, their eyes solemn, their legacy heavy. "You will find the household orderly," Mrs. Enfield said as they walked. "Structure is important here. The master values precision." "The master?" Tiffany asked, though she already knew the answer. Mrs. Enfield paused at a door and looked at her with a gravity that pressed against the heart. "Mr. Everett Blackstone." His name lingered in the air like the low toll of a distant bell. She was led into a study where the man himself stood before the tall windows, framed against the restless sea beyond. Everett Blackstone turned slowly, revealing a figure carved from command and restraint. Broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, with dark hair marked by silver, he emanated a quiet authority that needed no words to be felt. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice deep, even, and devoid of welcome. "Your credentials were suitable. I trust you will find everything in order." Tiffany inclined her head. "Thank you, Mr. Blackstone." His eyes, cold as polished steel, flicked over her with the briefest of evaluations, neither admiration nor disdain, merely the detached observation of a man assessing whether a new tool would serve its purpose. She sensed the weight he carried, though he made no effort to hide his disinterest in conversation. A man who had lost both love and peace did not waste breath on pleasantries. When he dismissed her, she followed Mrs. Enfield up a long corridor where carpets muffled their steps and lamps cast soft halos of amber light. At the end of the hall, the nursery door stood half open, as though the room itself hesitated to welcome her. Inside, a small figure sat silently on a cushioned seat by the window. Lillian Blackstone, 6 years old, delicate as a porcelain doll, her ash-blonde hair tied with a pale ribbon, stared toward the ocean with an expression too solemn for such a young face. Her hands rested rigidly on her lap. She did not look up. Mrs. Enfield cleared her throat gently. "Miss Caldwell is here to care for you." The child did not move. Not even a flicker of recognition touched her grey eyes. Tiffany approached slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness surrounding the girl. She knelt beside her, leaving a respectful space. "Hello, Lillian," she said softly. "It is a pleasure to meet you." The only response was the distant call of gulls outside the window. Mrs. Enfield sighed with resignation. "She hasn't spoken since the tragedy." She hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "Well, I shall leave you to settle." When she departed, the room grew quieter still. Tiffany stood, smoothing the front of her modest lavender dress, feeling the room's unspoken sorrow settle upon her shoulders. She unpacked slowly, placing her dresses neatly in the wardrobe, arranging the few small items she owned. As the afternoon faded into twilight, she lit a lamp that warmed the corners of the nursery. Later, when Lillian had tired and allowed herself to be guided to bed, Tiffany sat beside her, watching the child's eyelashes flutter in sleep. The soft glow of the lamp made the girl's face appear almost weightless, as though carved from moonlight. Tiffany reached into her pocket and unfolded the worn letter she always kept close. Her mother's last words, written in a shaky hand, whispered of love, resilience, and the hope that life would still offer Tiffany a place where she could live without fear of judgment. A single tear slipped down Tiffany's cheek as she traced the familiar lines. She folded the letter once more and tucked it safely away. Leaning forward, she brushed a stray lock of hair from Lillian's forehead with the back of her fingers, a gesture tender enough to tremble. "I'm not here to replace anyone," she whispered, her voice barely louder than breath. "I'm here to stay." Outside, the ocean roared against the cliffs, as though testing her resolve. Inside the nursery, a quiet promise settled in the air, delicate and enduring, like the first faint heartbeat of hope. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Rosegate House, soft and golden, as if reluctant to disturb the silence that ruled within its marble walls. Tiffany stood at the threshold of the nursery, her hands gently clasped before her, listening to the hollow stillness that had settled across the estate like dust on untouched bookshelves. In this house, nothing laughed, nothing cried. Everything simply endured. Each footstep on the parquet floor echoed louder than it should. Servants passed one another in hallways with polite nods, but seldom with words. There was no humming from the maids, no whistling from the footman as he polished the silver. The air held its breath. By her third morning, Tiffany had begun to understand why. The household moved according to a meticulous rhythm, orchestrated by habit and absence. Meals were served precisely on time. Linen was pressed to near perfection, but everything was executed with mechanical care, as though life had been reduced to duty alone. Mr. Blackstone remained a ghost behind closed study doors, emerging only for brief exchanges with Mrs. Enfield or to pace the library in solitary thought. Even in passing, he carried the aura of a man too burdened to speak. His footsteps, measured, precise, were the loudest presence in a house otherwise muted by grief and propriety. Lillian remained quiet, always. Tiffany had seen the child blink in acknowledgement, but never once heard a sigh, a whisper, or a laugh. Her world seemed confined to corners, the window seat, the far end of the nursery, the foot of her bed, where she clutched a frayed ribbon between her fingers as if it were her only anchor. On the fourth day, while dusting the shelves of the nursery's forgotten bookcase, Tiffany stumbled upon a small tin box hidden behind an old atlas. Its paint was chipped, its hinges rusted, but she recognized the object instantly, a music box. Gently, she wound the key. The melody that spilled forth was haunting, a lullaby in a minor key, its notes delicate as cobwebs, hesitant as a half-remembered dream. Tiffany turned toward Lillian, who had paused in the act of arranging wooden blocks on the rug. The girl's wide grey eyes flickered. There was something there. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. Curious, Tiffany examined the inside of the box's lid. Folded carefully into the velvet lining was a tiny sketch, faded pencil on torn paper. The face of a woman. Beautiful, regal, her mouth unsmiling, her eyes distant. A name was written in small, graceful script beneath it. Margaret. Tiffany held the box a moment longer, feeling its weight shift in her palm, heavy with a sorrow not her own. Later that evening she approached Mrs. Enfield in the linen room, where the housekeeper sorted fine napkins by candlelight with the precision of a banker handling coin. She was very beautiful, Tiffany said quietly. Lillian's mother. Mrs. Enfield paused, her hands stilling. Yes, she said after a moment. Beautiful, admired, quite proper. Tiffany waited. But she struggled, the older woman added at last, with warmth, with noise, with the child. Did she love her? Tiffany asked, almost against her better judgment. A long silence. Then, very softly, I believe she wanted to. No more was said. That same week another presence arrived at Rosegate, Beatrice Blackstone. She descended from her gleaming carriage in a whirl of silk and expectation, her auburn hair tucked into an ivory travelling hat, adorned with feathers the colour of wine. Her manner was crisp, her posture flawless, her eyes, sharp and narrow, swept over Tiffany with immediate calculation. I assume you are the governess, Beatrice said, not unkindly, but with the distinct chill of a woman who had spent a lifetime among the well-bred and the well-positioned, and knew exactly where others belonged. Tiffany curtsied. Miss Caldwell, at your service. Beatrice smiled with perfect symmetry. Of course you are. Beatrice's arrival shifted the balance of the household. She moved with authority through the drawing rooms, invited old friends for afternoon tea, and conversed with Everett in hushed tones late in the evening. Tiffany felt her eyes upon her often, when she walked the garden path with Lillian, when she rearranged the reading corner in the nursery, when she allowed the child to select her own ribbons from a small velvet pouch. You allow her to choose? Beatrice asked one morning, her voice measured as she observed Tiffany kneeling beside the child with a handful of pastel silks. She prefers the blue one on cloudy days, Tiffany replied without looking up. It seems to give her comfort. That is rather sentimental, don't you think? Children are allowed that luxury, Tiffany said gently. Beatrice said nothing more, but her silence crackled with disapproval. Still, Tiffany persisted in her small acts of defiance. She began leaving tiny notes on Lillian's dressing table, simple drawings of birds, flowers, even a miniature portrait of the girl herself with the sun rising behind her. She did not ask for thanks. She asked for nothing, only hoped that one day the child would find something in her quiet care worth holding on to. One afternoon, as Tiffany was tidying the nursery, she noticed a folded paper beneath Lillian's pillow. She hesitated, then opened it. A drawing. It was crude but unmistakable. A woman and a little girl holding hands beneath a tree. The woman had chestnut-colored hair. The girl wore a blue ribbon. Tiffany blinked hard, then carefully placed the paper back beneath the pillow. She did not speak of it. Not even to Lillian, yet something inside her stirred, not hope, not quite, but the shadow of it. The house remained silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of grief. It was the silence that comes before music. That night, as twilight sank the gardens into dusky lavender and the lamps flickered to life across the marble halls, Tiffany sat alone in the nursery armchair. Lillian had fallen asleep without resistance, curled beneath a quilt stitched with stars. Tiffany reached once again for the folded letter in her pocket, her mother's last gift, ink smudged, paper softened by time and handling. She ran her fingers along the familiar curve of her name. "You are stronger than they will allow you to be," the letter read, "and softer than they will know. Do not let them take either from you." She folded it once more, kissed the crease and slipped it back into her dress. Outside the nursery window, the moon cast a silver path across the ocean waves. The house still held its breath, but somewhere in the darkness, something had exhaled. Something had shifted. And Tiffany Caldwell, the fallen debutante turned governess, sat watching over the child of a silent house, heart steady, gaze unwavering, waiting for the day when the silence would finally break. The seventh morning dawned with a stillness that wrapped the cliffs of Newport in a veil of pearl-grey mist. The ocean was calm, its waves whispering secrets to the rocky shore far below. A low fog clung to the tall hedges of Rosegate House, softening the sharp lines of its marble facade. Tiffany stood at the nursery window, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where sea met sky, her fingers absently twisting the blue ribbon Lillian had chosen that morning. The child sat at her small table, drawing with focused quietude, her pale hair neatly braided. A faint trace of pink touched her cheeks, and for the first time Tiffany noticed a slight curve at the corners of her mouth. Not a smile, not quite, but the ghost of something that had once known joy. Outside, the air carried the tang of salt and a promise of warmth. Spring had given way to the gentle beginnings of summer, and the garden beyond the house shimmered with new blooms. Yet it was not the garden Tiffany yearned for today. She turned toward Lillian, her voice gentle, deliberate. "Would you like to see the sea?" The child froze, her pencil stilling mid-line. Her grey eyes lifted, wide, uncertain. Tiffany knelt beside her. "We don't have to go far, just near the cliffs. We can stay up high and look down. No one will touch the water unless they wish to." There was a long pause. Then slowly Lillian nodded. Bundled in a cream-colored cloak, with her hand nestled in Tiffany's gloved palm, the girl stepped outside. The household staff cast discreet glances from behind curtains as they passed through the gardens, but no one dared stop them. The air was brisk, the scent of lilac mingling with brine, and the path to the cliffs, rarely used, was lined with wild grass that danced in the wind. As they approached the edge, Lillian's steps faltered. Tiffany slowed with her, allowing the child to set the pace. The sea was vast today, dark blue and endless, its rhythm steady and unhurried. Birds wheeled in the sky, and far off, a sailboat drifted like a ghost across the water. Tiffany knelt beside Lillian, letting her cloak billow around her like a shield. "This is the same ocean your mother once looked at," she murmured, not avoiding the truth. "It can frighten us, but it can also carry things away. Worry, pain, silence." Lillian said nothing. Her gaze remained fixed on the surf below, eyes unreadable. And then, slowly, so slowly, she extended her hand, letting the sea breeze lift the end of her ribbon, her fingers curling in the salty air. A single tear welled in Tiffany's throat, but she did not let it fall. The girl did not cry. She only stood still, as if reclaiming something, but someone else was watching. From the stone balcony above, Everett Blackstone stood in shadow, arms crossed over his chest, his expression storm-dark. He had followed them without a word, his sharp instincts stirred by the shift in the household's rhythm, by the image of his daughter walking toward a place no one had dared take her since the tragedy. When Tiffany and Lillian returned from the cliffs, their cheeks flushed by wind and sun, they entered the grand hallway just as Everett descended the staircase. His voice, low and controlled, echoed in the marble silence. What were you thinking? Tiffany halted. Lillian froze behind her. You took her there, he said, eyes narrowed. To that place. To the very edge where her mother— I know where her mother died. Tiffany interrupted, her voice steady, her spine tall. And so does she. Everett's jaw clenched. She's a child, a fragile one. She's not made of glass, Tiffany replied. She's already broken. What she needs now is the chance to feel strong again, to face the thing that took something from her and see that it no longer controls her. Everett took a single step closer, his eyes like steel. That wasn't your decision to make. No, she agreed. But no one else was making it. Silence stretched between them, taut and electric. I would never risk her, Tiffany continued more softly now. But she's not healing because we keep her locked away from anything real. Sometimes we fear the very thing that could heal us. She stood at the edge and didn't look away. Everett's gaze flickered. Something shifted in his face, almost imperceptible. A memory, a reckoning. He said nothing more, only turned sharply and strode past them, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like judgment. That night, the house was quieter than usual. The staff moved cautiously, as if bracing for storms that never arrived. Tiffany remained in the nursery long after Lillian had fallen asleep, her heart heavy, unsure if she had overstepped a line she couldn't see. She wandered the gallery that connected the west wing to the formal parlor, seeking breath, seeking calm. There, on the far wall, a portrait caught her eye. She had seen it before in passing, never closely. Now she stepped toward it. It was a painting of Margaret Blackstone. The late Mrs. Blackstone had been striking. Her features were sculpted, her posture regal, her gown a cascade of pale silk. Pearls adorned her throat and ears, but her eyes, painted with masterful precision, were cold. Not cruel, not unkind, just absent. Her gaze passed through the viewer rather than into them. Tiffany stared at the portrait for a long while. There was no warmth in it, no softness, only a perfect woman captured in perfect oil. She looked nothing like Lillian. She looked nothing like Tiffany. The realization settled like a stone in her chest. And yet the girl had called her presence to the cliffs, had clung to her hand, had not cried. Later that evening, after Tiffany had tidied the nursery and folded her own shawl, she discovered something unexpected on the small writing desk beside the window. A sketchbook, unmarked. She opened it slowly. Inside, on the first page, was a drawing of the cliffs, clean lines, elegant perspective, the curve of the sea traced with deliberate care. On the edge stood two figures, one tall and cloaked, the other small and ribboned. No faces, no names, just presence. Together. A breath caught in her throat. There was no note, no name, but the style was unmistakable. Tiffany had seen a similar technique in the margins of the ledgers Everett carried in the study. The same precision. The same economy of line, a gift, an apology, a message. She closed the sketchbook carefully, her hands trembling just slightly. There were no spoken words between them that night, but something had been said all the same. And across the hallway, beneath the faint flicker of a gas lamp, the house, so long shrouded in sorrow, held its silence like a secret, and waited for what would come next. By the time the 10th day ripened beneath the Newport sun, Rosegate House had become a vessel of murmurs. Word traveled quickly along Bellevue Avenue, sliding through the iron gates and past the hedges trimmed with military precision. The whispers took shape at luncheons and promenade walks, swelling with curiosity as the elite pieced together fragments of rumor. There was talk of a young governess, unusually poised, unusually graceful, with a face soft enough to disarm and a presence quiet enough to unsettle. A woman whose beauty did not announce itself with jewels or silks, but with gentleness. Servants overheard their employers. The charming Nanny, they said, the mysterious Miss Caldwell, and in darker corners the fallen debutante. Tiffany, unaware of the full extent of these whispers, began to notice the shift in the servants' glances. Some were sympathetic, some cautious, but none indifferent. Rosegate House had been starved of feeling for so long that the faintest warmth now radiated through its servants like unexpected sunlight. It was Lillian who changed first. The girl, once so stiff and mechanical, began to mimic the simplest of Tiffany's gestures. She arranged flowers on the small table beside her bed with the same care Tiffany used in the mornings. She placed her shoes side by side, toes aligned, the way she had seen Tiffany do with her own modest pairs. She even began sitting with her hands folded in front of her, humble, composed, serene. Tiffany never mentioned it aloud. To acknowledge it too soon felt like risking a fragile bloom that had just begun to open. Each afternoon, Tiffany walked with Lillian through the rose garden. The child no longer clung to Tiffany's skirt. She walked beside her, quiet but steady. She touched the petals with careful fingers, traced the veins of leaves, and tilted her face toward the sun. During one such walk, Tiffany heard the unmistakable hum of carriage wheels crunching along the gravel driveway. Moments later, Everett Blackstone descended in a swirl of deep blue silk, her gown severe and elegant, her hat adorned with plumes that quivered with each precise step. Behind her emerged a woman Tiffany had never seen. She was tall, with auburn hair wrapped into a flawless chignon, her complexion creamy, her eyes sharp as cut glass. Her dress, pearl grey satin, clung to her like it had been made solely to celebrate her figure. She carried herself with the serene certainty of someone accustomed to admiration, Mrs. Hawthorne. Even before she introduced herself, Tiffany recognized the type. A widow, wealthy or ambitious enough to linger within the social circles that orbited men like Everett Blackstone, a woman who understood the game of eyes and gestures, of subtle postures and carefully crafted compliments. Beatrice led her toward the veranda with a theatrical air of confidentiality. "Tiffany," she called with polished courtesy, "would you be a dear and bring fresh lemonade to the veranda once you finish with the child? Mrs. Hawthorne is joining us for tea." The implication was clear. Not Miss Caldwell, not the governess, just Tiffany, a reminder of her place. Tiffany nodded with quiet grace. Of course. Lillian watched the exchange. Her small hand curled around Tiffany's. Later, as Tiffany arranged a tray of lemonade, crumpets, and preserved cherries in the kitchen, she overheard the faint murmur of voices drifting from the veranda. Beatrice was not being discreet. "She is gentle," Beatrice was saying, "but too gentle to navigate the expectations of this house. We cannot have rumors from New York following Everett now, can we?" Mrs. Hawthorne offered a sympathetic hum. "What sort of rumors?" "The kind that tarnish a family," Beatrice said. "A broken engagement. Accusations made in public. A man's reputation nearly ruined. Her parents lost their fortune over the scandal. It would be best if Everett kept a careful distance. A governess with a past is a liability." Tiffany's hands tightened around the tray. Her breath caught. She felt the old shame rise like smoke, bitter and choking. Her past, always her past. She closed her eyes. She had been 19 when she believed herself in love with a minor heir, a man who promised her a future and swore their affection was unbreakable. But when she expected respect, he offered humiliation. When she demanded honesty, he gave betrayal. And when she spoke openly of the truth he wished to hide, he retaliated with whispers that spread through New York faster than fire. Her parents paid the price. Their social circle shrank. Invitations dried up. Investments fell through. By the time Tiffany gained the courage to leave that world, it had already closed its doors to her. The hurt lingered, not as an open wound, but as a faint scar, a reminder of a young woman's naive faith and the coldness of those who had shaped her downfall. Tiffany carried the tray to the veranda with graceful steps, her expression serene, her shoulders squared. She set the refreshments on the table, avoiding Beatrice's eye. Mrs. Hawthorne smiled at her with polished charm. "Miss Caldwell, how lovely to meet you. I've heard such Interesting things. Tiffany bowed her head politely. I'm grateful to be here, ma'am. A breeze lifted the satin ribbon at her waist. Behind her, Lillian lingered near the veranda's edge, studied the adults with a seriousness that belied her years. When Tiffany caught the child's gaze, Lillian took a step closer, pressing against her side. It was a silent declaration, but a powerful one. Everett arrived moments later, stepping into the sunlight with the quiet authority that marked every movement he made. His presence drew a faint flush to Mrs. Hawthorne's cheeks, her posture straightening, her smile blooming like a well-timed flower. "Everett," she said warmly, "it has been far too long." He nodded with polite detachment. "Mrs. Hawthorne, welcome." His gaze flicked to Tiffany. So brief a glance it should have gone unnoticed, yet it left something warm trailing in its wake, as though the sun had shone through cloudy glass. Beatrice's smile tightened. Throughout the afternoon tea, Tiffany stood discreetly at the side, watching the three adults converse. Mrs. Hawthorne touched Everett's arm often, her laughter delicate, her compliments abundant. Beatrice encouraged every gesture, yet Everett's responses remained composed, distant. He offered Mrs. Hawthorne the same courteous attention he would grant any guest, nothing more. But when Lillian took Tiffany's hand again, drawing little circles with her thumb, Everett's expression softened. For a moment, something unguarded flickered across his face, something Tiffany dared not name. By the time tea concluded, the whispers had already slipped deeper into the marble halls of Rosegate. The staff spoke behind closed doors. Guests speculated as they left. Even Mrs. Enfield exchanged long looks with the butler, though she said nothing, but Tiffany felt it most in the way Everett's gaze lingered. Not prolonged, not improper, just long enough for her breath to catch. That night, when the estate sank into its familiar hush, Tiffany sat by the window of the nursery while Lillian slept soundly behind her. Moonlight spilled across the desk, illuminating the blank sheet of paper she had laid out with trembling hands. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write. "Dearest Mother, I do not know what is happening to me. For the first time in years, I feel seen, truly seen, not by society, who judged me without mercy, not by men who used promises like weapons, but by a child who looks at me as though I am shelter, and a man who looks at me as though he cannot look away." Her handwriting wavered. Tears pooled, not of sorrow, but of confusion, of longing, of a fragile hope she dared not name. She stopped writing before the ink dried completely. The letter, like so many before it, would never be sent, but it would remain, folded, kept and tucked close to her heart. As Tiffany Caldwell continued to walk the marble halls of Rosegate House, unaware that every whisper, every glance, every stolen heartbeat was leading her deeper into a destiny none of them could foresee. The sun rose on the morning of the Blackstone garden party with the kind of golden brilliance that seemed to promise perfection. The skies above Newport were clear, the breeze gentle, the air tinged with the scent of blooming wisteria and the salty memory of the sea. Rosegate House, which had long worn its silence like a shroud, now shimmered with activity. Servants moved with haste, but not chaos. Hands dusted furniture, polished glassware, fluffed silk cushions, and arranged silver trays under Beatrice Blackstone's watchful command. Beatrice had orchestrated every detail with military precision. Dozens of chairs had been placed across the emerald lawns, each aligned in immaculate rows. Lanterns draped in gauzy ribbons hung from the boughs of the oldest trees. A string quartet rehearsed beneath the marble pergola, their instruments gleaming under the early light. The finest linen cloths were laid across tables set for lemonade, champagne, and delicate pastries from the most exclusive patisserie in Providence. It was not just a party, it was a performance, a stage upon which reputations would rise or crumble. Tiffany stood at the nursery window, watching the preparations unfold. From above, the estate looked like a watercolor painting coming to life, delicate and composed. But she knew better than to be enchanted by appearances. Today was not meant for her, it was meant for them. The polished widow, the curated heirs, the veiled negotiations. And at the center of it all, Everett Blackstone, the man Beatrice intended to pair with Mrs. Hawthorne, as if his heart were a chess piece to be moved into position. Yet even in the middle of such spectacle, Tiffany's task was sacred. She turned back to Lillian. The child sat on the edge of her bed, her small hands resting nervously on her lap. Her grey eyes flicked to the window and then to Tiffany's face, searching for an answer she did not know how to ask. "You don't have to go. Not if it frightens you," Tiffany said softly, brushing a lock of pale hair behind the child's ear. "But if you do, I'll be beside you." Lillian didn't speak, but her small shoulders rose and fell with a breath that carried more weight than words. Tiffany chose a gown of soft white muslin, unadorned but lovely. She braided Lillian's hair in 2 simple plaits, tying each with a narrow blue ribbon. No jewels, no powder, no gloves, just the bare beauty of a child allowed to be herself. She dressed plainly herself, a muted lavender dress, high-collared, with a wide-brimmed straw hat that she held rather than wore. A governess among magnates, a whisper among trumpets. By early afternoon, the gardens filled with guests. Newport's elite had arrived in full plumage, ladies in pastel silks and feathered hats, gentlemen in white waistcoats and cravats, scented faintly with cologne. The orchestral music drifted over laughter and clinking glasses. Crystal bowls caught sunlight and scattered it in fragments across the lawn. Beatrice glided from group to group, her smile controlled, her fan fluttering like a weapon concealed behind lace. Mrs. Hawthorne, in a gown of palest lilac and a necklace that glinted with every tilt of her chin, clung to Everett's side. Her laughter, sweet as syrup, trailed him like perfume. Her gloved hand brushed his sleeve more times than was necessary. Tiffany watched from beneath the shade of a trimmed yew tree. She kept her gaze fixed not on Everett, but on Lillian, who stood only a few feet away, observing the chaos with an unreadable expression. Her small hands twisted the hem of her dress. Tiffany crouched to her level. "You don't have to talk," she whispered, "and you don't have to stay long. We'll just take a little walk. If it's too much, you can squeeze my hand, and we'll leave together." Lillian nodded. They walked among the guests like shadows among fireflies. Most people glanced at them with mild curiosity, unsure whether to smile or nod. A few women leaned toward one another with raised brows. The governess, that governess. But Tiffany kept her head high, her eyes calm, her hand steady at Lillian's back. Near the champagne table, Beatrice's voice cut through the air like glass. "She insisted on bringing the child out," she murmured to Mrs. Hawthorne. "Rather theatrical, don't you think?" Mrs. Hawthorne tilted her head with a knowing smirk. "Charming, if you like governesses who forget their place." Everett's eyes flicked toward them, just for a second, then away. Tiffany felt the heat of that glance across the distance. She did not flinch, but something inside her shivered, and then something happened. A waiter, young and nervous, tripped over the edge of a carpet laid too hastily. A tray tipped. A bottle of champagne struck the corner of a table. Glass exploded into 1,000 slivers, sharp as ice, sudden as thunder. The music stopped, and Lillian froze. She stood rooted to the ground, her eyes wide with panic, her hands pressed against her ears. Her breath came too fast. Her chest rose and fell in shallow spasms. The world went quiet, but in her ears it must have roared. Tiffany dropped to her knees beside her. "Lillian, it's all right. You're safe." The child turned to her slowly, her mouth parted, her eyes desperate. For a moment, she only trembled, and then her voice. A whisper, so fragile it could have shattered like the glass itself. "Mom." The word hung in the air, a single word, one syllable, not a cry, not a plea, a truth. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Someone dropped a glass. Beatrice's fan stilled. Mrs. Hawthorne's smile vanished. And Everett dropped to his knees, not in performance, not in pain, in surrender. His hand covered his mouth as his eyes filled with something raw and trembling, grief, awe, and a kind of reverence. Tiffany gathered Lillian into her arms. The girl clung to her, her body trembling, her breath hitching against Tiffany's collarbone. Tiffany pressed her cheek to the crown of her head, her own eyes wide with disbelief. The guests murmured. A woman whispered, "Did she say—" "She called her. I didn't know she could speak." The orchestra sat frozen, boughs hovering above strings. Champagne spilled across white linen. Beatrice turned her gaze slowly toward her brother, her face expressionless, and Everett did not rise. He looked at Tiffany holding his daughter, and for a single breathless moment, the marble walls of Rosegate cracked open. When at last Tiffany rose to her feet, holding Lillian close, she did not look at the guests. She did not speak to Beatrice or Everett or Mrs. Hawthorne. She simply walked back into the house, her spine straight, her steps measured. Lillian's arms remained locked around her neck. Behind them, the party crumbled into whispers and speculation. And by dawn, every parlour in Newport spoke of only one thing: the child who broke her silence, the governess who held her, and the powerful man who fell to his knees before them both. By the second morning after the garden party, the roses in the Blackstone gardens had begun to wilt, not from heat or neglect, but from something less visible and far more corrosive. Whispers bloomed faster than flowers in Newport, and the name Tiffany Caldwell now passed through silk-gloved hands and perfumed parlours like a secret too delicious to suppress. The tale, distorted, embellished, repeated, unfolded with the urgency of scandal and the precision of gossip. The governess, the child who had never spoken, the word she chose to break her silence, and the man who fell to his knees before her. By the afternoon of the third day, Mrs. Enfield informed Tiffany that inquiries had come from 3 separate households, each phrased as polite curiosity about Miss Caldwell's qualifications. That was when Tiffany understood. Her presence at Rosegate had become a matter not only of sentiment, but of consequence. The first real blow came at breakfast. Tiffany was not invited. She waited outside the dining room with Lillian's breakfast tray balanced carefully in her hands, only to be informed by a stone-faced maid that Miss Blackstone would be dining alone with her uncle and aunt today. Lillian had not spoken a word since the party, not one. Her eyes followed Tiffany wherever she moved, her small frame tense with confusion, but she made no sound. It was not the same blank silence as before. It was the silence of a question left unanswered, of fear returning where hope had once dared to bloom. Tiffany brought the child her favorite tea with honey and a slice of bread spread with rose jam. Lillian barely touched either. She only sat on the window seat of the nursery, twisting the blue ribbon between her fingers until the fabric grew limp. At midday, Beatrice summoned Tiffany to the drawing room. The light was sharp and cold, filtered through tall windows that did nothing to warm the stone beneath. Beatrice stood like a statue before the unlit fireplace, her gloved hands folded in front of her, her expression carved from ice. "I assume," she began without preamble, "that you are aware of the damage done." Tiffany did not flinch. "If you mean the child speaking, yes, I'm aware." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "You allowed her to call you mother, in front of dozens of guests, important guests, men of influence, their wives. Do you understand the implications of what you've done?" "She chose that word," Tiffany said quietly. "Not I. That distinction matters little now." Beatrice's voice never rose. It didn't need to. Every syllable was sharpened by contempt. "The papers in Providence have begun printing rumours. Mrs. Hawthorne has taken great pains to clarify your past to her circle." "My past is not a secret." "No," Beatrice replied, "but until now it was not a liability." That word struck harder than Tiffany expected. Liability. It fell heavier than shame. Beatrice's next words came like velvet over steel. "Your services here are no longer appropriate." Tiffany stared at her. "Is that Mr. Blackstone's decision?" He is under immense pressure. His investors are threatening to withdraw if he allows this emotional entanglement to overshadow his judgment. You've made him vulnerable, Miss Caldwell. And in his position, vulnerability is a luxury he cannot afford. Tiffany's voice did not tremble. I have never asked him for anything. But you have his daughter's heart, Beatrice said, and now you are the scandal on everyone's tongue. Your very presence here will cost him more than reputation. It will cost him trust, capital, power. Tiffany said nothing. She simply turned and walked out. That evening, long after the estate had fallen quiet, she stood in the doorway of Everett's study. He was seated at his desk, sleeves rolled, collar undone, his posture taut, as if the chair no longer fit his shape. A decanter of brandy sat untouched to his right. The fire had burned low. He did not look up when she entered. I'm resigning, she said softly. His hand stilled over a page. Is that necessary? Your investors think so. Your sister thinks so. Newport thinks so. A long silence stretched between them, thick with things unsaid. She needs you, he murmured at last. She needed to find her voice, Tiffany replied. And she did, but if I stay, and this continues to spiral around her, she will lose it again. She will learn that every word costs something. He looked at her now, and in his eyes was a storm too vast to name. I will not be the reason she learns silence again, she finished. He rose from the desk with a slow deliberation that carried the weight of someone used to commanding men, commanding trains, commanding empires, and realizing in that moment that he could not command the one thing he wanted most to keep. He walked toward her, stopped only a step away, and said, Then I will not stop you. She nodded. His face was unreadable. As if to show emotion, now would be a betrayal of everything he had trained himself not to feel. Tiffany left the room with her chin high and her heart hollow. In the nursery, she packed her few dresses with quiet hands. The blue ribbon, the sketchbook Everett had left, the letter she had never mailed, the brooch from her mother. The moon climbed high above the garden, casting silver across the bed where Lillian now lay, restless, her cheeks flushed with unshed questions. Tiffany tried to move without waking her, but the child stirred. And then, without a word, she rose and walked straight into Tiffany's arms, wrapping herself around her with the fierce strength of someone clinging to the last thing they understood. Tiffany sank to the floor, holding her tightly. Lillian did not speak. She did not need to. She only held her, for hours, until her small body surrendered to sleep. Only then did Tiffany cry, not for herself, but for the little girl who had finally spoken and would wake tomorrow to find the one person she had trusted most gone, and for the man who had not asked her to stay, and for the heart she had given, without permission, in silence. The rain came soft and steady on the morning Tiffany Caldwell left Newport behind. A quiet, persistent drizzle washed the summer from the stones of the city and shrouded Rosegate House in a curtain of mist. No one had come to see her off. No carriage followed hers. No voice called her name. And yet, as the narrow roads carried her farther from the estate, from the child she loved, and the man whose silence echoed louder than any goodbye, Tiffany sat with her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, a single satchel at her feet, and her back held as straight as the day she was presented to society. She had not left in shame. That was the only promise she could keep to herself. Providence, with its cobbled streets and narrow alleys, welcomed her not as a governess, not as a debutante fallen from favor, but simply as a woman willing to work. The boarding house was modest, its walls thin, its furniture worn from too many tenants who had come seeking second chances. But the rent was fair, and the room was warm, and from her narrow window, Tiffany could see the steeple of a church rising beyond the rooftops. She found work at a school for orphan girls nestled beside a shuttered mill, where a kindly headmistress named Mrs. Tilton, long widowed and even longer disillusioned with wealth, welcomed her with cautious kindness. The children, some solemn, some wild, were drawn to Tiffany's steady voice, her soft hands, her ability to coax music from a battered pianoforte and turn penmanship into art. She taught them scales in the morning and letters in the afternoon, and in the quiet hours after nightfall, when the city was still and the boarding house dim, she wrote. She wrote letters she never sent. On the first evening, seated at the small writing desk by the window, she dipped her pen in ink and addressed the first envelope to Lillian. My dearest little one, you are stronger than they know. You are a storm waiting to bloom into sunlight. I miss your hand in mine. I miss the way you listened to the birds before you dared to speak. I miss your silence as much as your voice, because in both you were always telling me something true. Don't be afraid to speak again, even if I'm not there to hear it. She signed it with trembling fingers. The next night, she wrote to Everett. Mr. Blackstone, I do not know if you stood at the window as I left. I do not know if you listened for the closing of the carriage door or the sound of wheels turning away. Perhaps you remained at your desk, pretending it was all for the best. I forgive you for that, but I hope one day you will learn to forgive yourself for all the things you never allowed yourself to feel. On the third night, she wrote to her mother, Dearest Mama, I left again, but this time I did not run, I did not crumble. I carried your brooch close to my heart and walked out with dignity, with grace, and with my name still whole. I did not bow to cruelty. I did not let them strip me of the goodness I fought to preserve. You once told me that the world would try to measure me by what it could take from me. But I have given freely, and that is the difference. Each letter was folded and tucked away in a small wooden box she kept beside her lamp. She never sealed them, she never planned to, but writing them made the silence bearable. Days passed, and across the sea-clad cliffs of Newport, within the silent walls of Rosegate House, nothing was as it had been. The garden grew overgrown. The corridors, once bustling in preparation for afternoon teas and midnight telegrams, became still again. Even the music room stood locked, its keys untouched. Lillian withdrew. She answered no questions. She played with no toys. She stopped eating jam on her toast. She stopped choosing her ribbons. She began once again to sit in windows. Everett noticed it all. He noticed it in the long pauses between his own sentences, in the way Lillian now refused to enter the drawing room, in the way her eyes no longer brightened when the sea was visible in the distance. But most of all, he noticed it in the quiet. It was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of absence. Each night, he returned to his study, opened books he did not read, and signed letters he did not remember writing. His hands moved by habit, but his thoughts did not follow. His mind, sharp, calculating, revered by railroad men and factory owners alike, had become a maze in which he wandered without direction. One night, well after midnight, Everett crossed the hall to check on Lillian. He had not done so in weeks. She was curled in bed, her eyes closed, her breath slow and uneven. On the pillow beside her, beneath the corner of her quilt, he saw something clutched in her small hand. His steps slowed. He knelt beside the bed, careful not to wake her, and gently lifted the edge of the blanket. It was a brooch, worn and simple, a small enamel flower pressed in brass. He remembered it. It had once been pinned to the bodice of Tiffany's lavender dress. He closed his hand over it slowly. He said nothing, but when he rose to his feet, he did not return to his study. Instead, he entered the nursery. Everything was as she had left it. The rocking chair, the books she had stacked in neat piles, the ribbon box. On the desk beneath the window sat the sketchbook, the one he had left for her after the day at the cliffs. He opened it, expecting blank pages, but on the fourth page, drawn with quiet grace, was a sketch. A child holding a man's hand at the edge of the ocean. The man's head was bowed. The child was looking toward the horizon, and behind them, watching from a short distance, stood a woman in a cloak. Her figure was small, but it radiated light. Everett sat in that room for a long time, the sketchbook open in his lap, the brooch in his hand. Something broke inside him. Not loudly, not violently. It broke like a tide receding after years of drowning, revealing all that had been lost beneath the waterline. When the dawn came pale and grey over the sea, Everett rang for his carriage. His voice was hoarse when he gave the order to the driver. Providence, and nothing more. The road from Newport to Providence was not long, but for Everett Blackstone it stretched like a confession. The steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth matched the silent beats of his heart. And though the carriage was closed and the windows fogged with morning mist, he could not escape the clarity within him. Every turn of the wheel was a reckoning. Every mile carried the weight of what had been unspoken for too long. He had not sent word ahead. He didn't know what he would say, or if she would even see him. He only knew that something vital had been lost when she left Rosegate, something that had not belonged to him until he had let it go. By the time the carriage stopped in the heart of the city, the sky had lifted into a soft shade of blue. The scent of coal and wet brick lingered in the streets. He stepped down onto the pavement, his coat collar high, his gloved hands tight at his sides, as if his dignity could protect him from the uncertainty that awaited. A narrow alley led him to the side entrance of a low, weather-worn church. The windows were stained with age rather than art, the door swollen with years of rain. But through the cracks and stone he could hear music, children's voices, and hers. He paused. She was singing softly, leading a group of orphan girls in a hymn. The notes wavered here and there, young voices slipping in and out of tune, but she steadied them with her own voice. Calm, rich, familiar. The sound reached him like a warmth he had long forgotten. She was seated at a piano, the instrument old but loved, its wood darkened by time. A shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair, still chestnut and gleaming in the filtered light, was tied in a simple knot at her nape. No pearls, no silk, no lace. Just a woman who had given everything and asked for nothing. He stepped forward as the final note faded. The girls clapped and giggled and scattered toward their seats. She looked up. Her expression did not change at first. There was no smile, no frown. Only breath held in her chest, as if the mere sight of him had knocked the air from her lungs. He removed his hat slowly. "Tiffany," he said. The sound of her name in his voice made something shift in the room. She rose from the bench, composed, but her fingers trembled slightly as she rested them against the edge of the piano. "Mr. Blackstone," she replied. He looked around the modest room, the peeling paint, the mismatched chairs, the pile of slates and chalk. Then he looked at her. "You built something here," he said quietly. "I'm trying," she answered. The silence stretched between them. She dismissed the children with a soft smile and a nod toward Mrs. Tilton, who guided them out with motherly authority, leaving the two of them alone in the echo of what had once been sacred music. He stepped closer. "I came to say what I should have said long ago," he murmured. She tilted her head, but did not speak. He swallowed. "I married for ambition, not affection. Margaret was chosen for me, and I let myself believe that power would make me immune to regret. But regret is patient. It waits. It seeps, and it drowned every good thing I might have become." His voice cracked. "I have spent years fearing failure more than loneliness, because failure, I was taught, is unforgivable. But you made me see that love, real love, asks us to risk everything." Tiffany's eyes did not leave his. "You never failed her," she said, her voice soft, steady. "You only stopped believing you could succeed." He took a breath, as if her words had pierced something he'd locked away. "I'm not here to bring you back to Rosegate as an employee," he said. "I won't insult you with that." She nodded once. "Because I wouldn't accept it." He stepped closer. "I know. I won't be hidden," she continued. "I won't be explained away or tolerated in the margins. I've already lived through that kind of silence, and I won't do it again, not for anyone. I won't ask you to," he said. Then, after a pause, he added with unguarded clarity, "Come back. Not as a governess, not as a scandal. Come back. For you, for her, for us." His words filled the space like the final chord of a sonata, unexpected, fragile, perfect, but Tiffany didn't answer. Not then. She looked at him, not with resistance, but with something deeper. She stepped past him, slowly, and crossed the room to her shawl and satchel. She picked up her gloves, folded them neatly. Her movements were deliberate. "I need to think," she said at last. He bowed his head, not in disappointment, but in reverence. "I'll wait," he said. That evening, as twilight brushed the rooftops of Providence with lavender, Tiffany left the boarding house and walked alone to the cliffs that bordered the edge of the city. They were not as dramatic as Newport's, not carved by centuries of wind and wealth, but they overlooked the same restless ocean. She stood there, facing the vastness of the sea, the air cool on her cheeks. It was at the cliffs where everything had begun to unravel, and where something deeper had first taken root. The silence that had lived in Lillian, the silence that had lived in her. And now, in the hush of dusk, Tiffany listened to her own heartbeat and waited for its answer. She opened the small wooden box she had carried from Rosegate. Inside were her unsent letters. She read them one last time. Then, with fingers steady, she took the letter addressed to Everett and released it into the breeze. She did not need to send it now, because tomorrow she would speak for herself. The gates of Rosegate swung open just past noon. The horses stirred restlessly as the carriage approached the circular drive, its wheels crunching softly over the gravel that gleamed under the autumn sun. There were no banners, no music, no anticipation from society, only the hush of a house that had not dared to hope. Tiffany sat with her gloved hands resting lightly in her lap, her back straight, her breath held like porcelain in her chest. The dress she wore was simple but elegant, pale lavender, the color of dusk on the sea. No brooch fastened it, no apron covered it, nothing to suggest servitude. She had come not as governess, not as guest, but as herself. The moment the carriage stilled, the great oak doors opened. Mrs. Enfield stood first. Behind her, kitchen maids leaned in with wide eyes, half hidden behind columns. A footman stepped forward, but paused as if unsure what role to play in this homecoming. It was not the return of a governess, it was something else entirely, something the house had no name for. Tiffany descended alone. She took no hurried steps, no gaze searched the threshold. She had not come to seek approval or even forgiveness. She had come for the only two souls whose voices lived inside her now, one that had shattered silence with a single word, and the other who had yet to say what his eyes confessed. As she reached the final step, a breathless cry cut through the stillness. "Mama!" The word did not tremble, it did not falter. It soared, fierce and full, from the small chest of Lillian Blackstone, who barreled out the front door in a white cotton frock, curls loose from their ribbon, cheeks flushed from having waited too long. Tiffany barely had time to open her arms before the child collided with her, arms thrown tight around her waist, little face pressed into her lavender skirts. Gasps echoed from the entrance. One maid clapped her hand to her mouth. The other began to weep quietly, joyfully. Mrs. Enfield stepped back, blinking furiously. Tiffany crouched slowly, drawing Lillian close, her voice a whisper. "There you are, my brave girl." "Mama," Lillian said again, louder this time, as if now that the dam had broken, she would never hold back again. "Mama." The sound of hurried footsteps on marble followed, and Everett appeared at the door, still in his shirt sleeves, breath uneven, as though he had run from his study the moment he'd heard. He froze at the top step. Tiffany did not rise. She remained kneeling, arms wrapped around the child who now clung to her like a lifeline. When Everett's gaze met hers, it was no longer guarded, no longer torn between fear and duty. It was raw, open, irrevocably changed. "Let her speak it," Tiffany said softly, stroking Lillian's hair. "Let her claim it." He descended one step, then another, and another. But before he could reach them, a sharp voice sliced through the air. "This has gone far enough." Beatrice Blackstone emerged like a storm contained in satin. Her dark gown rustled with each indignant step as she moved across the threshold. "You would let this spectacle destroy what little remains of your name?" she demanded, voice trembling with fury. "Of our name." Everett turned to face her, but his posture did not shift. He did not raise his voice. He did not blink. "I built this house," he said, "and every rail, every ledger, every steel beam beneath it." Beatrice flinched, but said nothing. "I built it to protect her," he continued, nodding toward the child still wrapped around Tiffany. "Not to become its prisoner." Beatrice's lips parted as though to argue, but whatever words had come, they died on her tongue. For the first time, she seemed to realize she had lost, not in society's eyes, but in the one court that mattered, the home she'd never truly belonged to. She turned sharply and vanished into the vestibule, her heels clacking like punctuation against the tile. Everett looked back at Tiffany, who now stood with Lillian's hand in hers. The child looked between them, uncertain of what would come next. He stepped forward, slowly, until he was only inches away. Then, with a grace that defied his station and a humility that reshaped the very bones of the house, he sank to one knee, not in shame or repentance, but in reverence. He did not speak. He did not have to. The question, one he had not yet dared ask, was already alive in his eyes, shining with the quiet ache of a man who had learned what truly mattered. Tiffany extended her hand, not in permission, not in forgiveness, in answer. He took it, and for a moment, everything else, the whispers, the scandals, the years lost to silence, fell away. There was only the man, the woman, and the child, together. They stepped inside, side by side, and the great doors of Rosegate closed behind them, not to keep anyone out, but to let something finally, beautifully begin. The bells of St. Helena's did not ring that morning, nor did the papers print a single word. There was no engraved invitation, no embroidered banner stretched across Rosegate's gates, no orchestra warming its strings in a gilded ballroom. Newport society, so often feverish with anticipation for the spectacle of union, remained blissfully unaware that the most powerful man on the coast would marry not with trumpets or tiaras, but with bare feet and salt air. It was the first day of summer. The breeze off the Atlantic was soft and teasing, carrying the scent of sea foam and honeysuckle through the high gardens of Rosegate, which bloomed now with untamed colour. The estate had changed in the year since Tiffany's return, not in bricks or furnishings, but in sound. Where silence once choked the air, there were now songs from the piano in the parlour. Laughter echoed faintly in the upper halls. Lillian's footsteps danced instead of crept. And today, the child who once could not speak would sing. On the cliff's edge, just beyond the wild roses that gave the house its name, 3 rows of wooden chairs were placed on the grass. A white cloth whipped gently around the posts of a simple trellis. No bishop, no titled guests, no diamond-dripping aunts came to witness the vows. Only those who had endured the silence and stayed to see it break. Mrs. Enfield sat quietly in the last row, her lace-gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her hat trembled slightly as the wind caught the veil, and when the child stepped forward with a hymn trembling in her little voice, clear, brave and radiant, Mrs. Enfield's composure collapsed in soft, grateful tears. Everett stood at the altar in a linen suit the colour of sand, his dark hair tousled by the breeze. He wore no cravat, no medal, no emblems of industry or wealth. Just a small white rose in his lapel, and the solemn, astonished expression of a man who had been broken once and found himself rebuilt. Not in steel, but in the arms of a woman and the laughter of a child. Tiffany appeared at the top of the path with the sun behind her, casting a golden halo around her figure. Her dress was ivory, not bridal white, with lace along the sleeves and hem like sea foam. Her veil was soft tulle, pinned with lavender sprigs from Lillian's hand. There was no train, no diamonds, no procession. She walked slowly alone, barefoot in the grass until she reached him. Their vows were not shouted, nor read by clergy. They were whispered, shared as secrets between two hearts that had long been denied peace. No promises of perfection, only truth. Everett touched her cheek when he spoke. "I will never build another wall between us." Tiffany held his hand to her heart. "And I will never again mistake silence for safety." When he slipped the ring onto her finger, her hands did not tremble. Her eyes, filled with tears, never left his. Lillian, sitting in the front row with wildflowers woven into her curls, let out a gleeful giggle as the first wave broke loudly below the cliffs, startling the doves into flight. Her laughter scattered upward with them into the blue, unburdened sky. After the ceremony, they did not dine on caviar or waltz on marble. Instead, they wandered down the winding path to the shore. The tide had receded, leaving a stretch of glistening sand where foam and light met in playful chaos. Tiffany removed her shoes and stepped into the surf first. Lillian followed, shrieking with joy as the water rushed over her toes. She chased the waves and let them chase her back, her laughter unspooling like a ribbon through the salt air. Everett rolled up his sleeves, dropped his coat, and joined them, catching Tiffany's hand with sudden gravity. "Wait," he said. She turned, her hair loose and catching the wind. "I have stood in many rooms," he said. "Rooms full of power, men who would sell their souls for steel and cities, and I have felt nothing." He placed her hand over his chest. "Here, in this silence, with you and her, I feel everything." Tiffany's throat tightened. She looked toward the child, spinning in the foam with arms wide like a ship's sails, then back at the man who had once been too afraid to listen to his own heart. "You brought us back to life," he whispered. She smiled, her lips trembling. "No," she said softly. "She brought us both home." The sun began to dip into the sea, casting golden light over their faces. Around them the world grew quiet, not the hollow silence that once haunted the halls of Rosegate, but the kind that follows music when the last note is still ringing in the soul. They stood together, barefoot, wind-kissed and soaked at the hem, the tide pulling away all the sorrow that had once weighed them down. As the final light disappeared beneath the horizon, Everett lifted Tiffany into his arms, just as Lillian ran back to them, wet and gleaming like a pearl returned to the sea. The three walked home along the shore. No audience, no headlines, only the memory of a day that would live quietly in their hearts. Rosegate stood tall behind them, no longer a fortress. It had become a haven, and though the sun had set, their story rose, quietly, eternally, together. The sea was calmer now. Its waves still curled gently along the cliffs below Rosegate, but the fury it once echoed, the grief, the silence, the regret, had long since quieted into memory, and like all memories softened by time, it came back only when called, on certain dusks, in the pause between a child's laughter and the nightingale's cry, or in the hush before a letter is opened, one long sealed. Tiffany stood on the veranda of Rosegate, her hands gently resting on the curve of her second child, just shy of his 3rd birthday, curled up asleep on a quilt beside her. The light of the late afternoon touched his pale curls, identical to Lillian's once. A wind from the sea brought the scent of jasmine and salt, wrapping her in a moment she knew she would remember even years from now. She was 31 now, and the lines at the corners of her eyes, fine as embroidery thread, had come not from sadness, but from too many moments of holding in laughter until it escaped. Inside, the house had changed. Music came from the parlor now most evenings, usually from the hands of a girl with long legs and a ribbon in her braid. Lillian, now 12, was fluent in both French and joy. Her voice had never left her after that day on the cliffs. She sang often. She scolded her younger brother gently when he spilled ink on his trousers. She called Tiffany Mama as naturally as she breathed. Everett had changed too. He had become slower to anger, quicker to smile. The industry had shifted since 1896, the railroads weakened by political reform, fortunes shrinking as new laws favored unions and regulation. Everett had faced it with quiet dignity, gradually stepping away from the helm of his empire and choosing instead to invest in smaller ventures. A school for girls, a conservatory for music, a hospital wing bearing the Blackstone name, not for pride, but for use. He no longer ruled from his study. More often than not, one could find him in the garden on Sundays, sleeves rolled, boots muddied, hair kissed with early grey. And when Tiffany joined him, basket in hand, lips stained from berry picking, he would kiss the back of her neck and whisper that he'd never once known the sound of happiness until she gave it shape. Beatrice had not returned to Rosegate since the wedding. After her final attempt to discredit Tiffany failed, she retreated to Europe, where her letters now arrived once a year, terse, polite, and empty of warmth. She never married again. Some say she lives in a villa outside Florence, with an aging painter and a small white dog named Regret. Mrs. Hawthorne was last seen in Boston, trying to secure a fourth husband. None dared speak her name within Rosegate's walls. Mrs. Enfield had remained. The old housekeeper had grown softer, slower, and now passed her days embroidering by the window of her smaller room at the back of the house. She insisted she would retire one day soon, but not until little Everett Henry could say her name without tripping over the consonants. Tiffany knelt beside her son and brushed the sand from his temple. He stirred slightly, then sighed into her lap. Safe in a world she had once thought lost forever, her eyes moved toward the garden where Lillian sat with her father on the grass, painting the sky with watercolors. She had become the kind of child who paused mid-stroke to study the clouds, and the kind of sister who taught her brother the difference between shades of blue. Everett looked up from his sketch and found Tiffany's gaze. He did not speak. He didn't need to. In 6 years, he had learned the poetry of stillness. Tiffany smiled and rested her cheek atop her son's head. She thought of the girl she once was, the one who arrived with a broken heart, a forgotten letter, and no voice of her own. Now all around her the house was filled with voices, not only her children's, not only Everett's, but her own, woven into the fabric of the halls, in the book she read aloud at night, in the songs she hummed while stitching worn cuffs, in the soft yes she breathed into his chest each time he held her after the world had gone quiet. Rosegate still stood above the cliffs, but it was no longer a fortress of silence. It was a house where laughter lingered, where second chances bloomed with wild roses, where love had not only survived, but transformed every stone, every soul it touched. And as the sun lowered into the same horizon that once held nothing but sorrow, it now kissed the sea with promise. Tiffany closed her eyes and listened to the waves, to the wind, to the life she had built, not perfectly, not easily, but truly. Forever. Some stories arrive softly, like a tide returning to shore after years of silence. The widowed magnate's daughter was never about power or grand gestures. It was about healing, about how love, when quiet and true, can mend the deepest cracks in the soul. Tiffany's journey teaches us that our past does not define us, and that even after the world turns its back, kindness, courage, and dignity can light a new path. Everett reminds us that strength is not found in steel or wealth, but in the humility to ask for forgiveness, and in the grace to love again. And little Lillian. She reminds us that the smallest voice, once freed, can echo through an entire home and change everything. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something you hadn't felt in a while, hope, perhaps, or a gentle ache, leave a comment below and share your thoughts. I'd love to know what part touched your heart most, and if you made it all the way here to the end, write the word Rosegate in the comments. That way, I'll know who stayed until the last light of this chapter, and together we'll keep this community growing. If you'd like to help support the storytellers and artists who make these tales possible, you're warmly invited to send a super thanks in any amount you wish. Every gesture, big or small, helps us bring more stories like this one to life. And if that's not something you can do right now, you can still help us immensely by sharing this video with someone who loves a good historical romance. A friend, a sister, your mother, your grandmother. Someone who understands that sometimes the quietest love stories are the ones that stay with us the longest. And when this story ends, another begins. Don't forget to check the cards I've left here for you, with more unforgettable romances from the Gilded Age and beyond. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing in stories like this. See you in the next one.